Guys, it's finally happened. I feel like we've talked about rumors for this device for a really, really long time, but Motorola has finally officially announced and unveiled the Moto Razr and Razr Plus. Now, depending on the region that you are in, that might be called the Razr 40 and the Razr 40 Ultra. It is region specific, but in the United States, apparently the name is just Moto Razr and Razr Plus. It's a bit confusing because there've already been several Moto Razrs, but whatever, that's what we're getting. Let's take a moment here and break down the specs. We'll start first with the Razr Plus or the Razr 40 Ultra, depending upon the region, because that's the one that is coming first, and it will be coming to the United States, which is a really, really big deal for some reasons that we're going to talk about here in a moment as we go through these specs. So first off, we do have a 6.9-inch Full HD Plus display on the inside. That is our folding display, and it does run at 165 Hertz, which is really, really impressive. That is an extremely high refresh rate. We also have that 3.6-inch massive cover display that also runs at 144 Hertz. Not only is this thing huge, it runs at a high refresh, which is really cool, and it allows you to run full applications on that cover display. You can see where the two cameras are punching holes through that cover display. There's even a nice option to shrink the app you're running or whatever's on that screen to kind of be above those two hole punches, so it's very well thought out. This thing internally has the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, which is not the fastest processor on the market, but I think it's going to be enough to be a relatively quick device. I'm not super troubled by that. 8 gigs or 12 gigs of RAM, 256 or 512 gigabytes of storage, and I actually typed 513 there, which is an error. As for the cameras, we're getting a 12 megapixel primary that has 1.4 micrometer pixels, which is relatively large. This thing should take decent photos, although we do need to see samples before we really start judging these cameras. There's also a 13 megapixel ultra wide. 32 megapixel selfie camera is a hole punch on the inside of the device. There is a relatively large 3800 milliamp hour battery with 30 watt wired charging and 5 watt wireless charging, which is pretty darn slow. 30 watt isn't too bad. 5 watt wireless is pretty slow, but still, that's a decently large battery, but that cover display is quite large. It's going to come down to, in terms of battery life, how much time are you spending using that cover display versus using that nearly 7-inch 165 Hz refresh rate OLED display there on the inside. And most interestingly, IP52 rating, which means it's water resistant, but it is also slightly dust resistant, which I believe is the first foldable with dust resistance. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's the only one I can think of. Now that Moto Razr Plus, or maybe it's the 40 Ultra, depending on where you are, is available starting now in China and in parts of Europe. Pre-orders are going to open up on June the 16th for the United States, with full availability shipping out June the 23rd, and it is starting at $999. That puts it right there with the Z Flips of the world. Of course, we're going to be getting a Z Flip 4 very, very soon. A couple of months, or maybe a month or two. Yeah, a couple of months after this thing is out, the Flip 4 will be out, likely for the very same price. So now the United States will have two competing flip phones right there side by side with the same price. This is very, very exciting. Of course, that Flip 4 is going to have a newer chipset inside, likely the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. But a lot of these other specs are going to be very, very similar. So I think it's going to serve as a pretty decent competitor for that device. The cover displays are going to both be quite large. So it'll be very interesting to see which one does that aspect better. And it'll obviously be very interesting to see which device actually winds up being the better phone. But of course, that was not the only device that they fully unveiled. This is the standard model, okay? And some of the specs are very, very similar. Same 6.9-inch screen, but now it's only running at 144 Hertz rather than 165. The cover display, as you can see, is quite a bit smaller. It is also running the Snapdragon 7 Gen 1, which is the new mid-range chipset. I believe it's supposed to be something like 30 or 40% faster than the old Snapdragon 778G. So this thing should be pretty decent, and the battery life should be aided by that kind of mid-range processor. We also get 8 or 12 gigs of RAM, 128 or 256 gigabytes of ROM, a 64 megapixel primary camera with 0.7 micrometer pixels. Of course, it'll be binned down to 12 megapixels. So again, we'll have to wait and see how these photos actually look in samples before we judge them. 13 megapixel ultra wide, 32 megapixel selfie camera, and a very large 4200 milliamp hour battery. We're getting rid of that giant cover display, but we're kind of replacing it with a giant battery. So in my mind, 30 watt wired charging, 5 watt wireless charging, same IP52 rating. This thing might actually be more interesting for some people, because what you have is a foldable that kind of looks a bit durable, a bit like it might last a full day quite easily, and we don't have the price on this thing yet, but it's supposed to be considerably cheaper. Is this thing going to be what? $799? $699? Who knows? It's going to be less than $1,000 though. So when this thing launches, and they are, by the way, saying it will launch in the United States later this year, not only will it produce even more competition for the Z Flip 4, it's going to be potentially the first truly budget-friendly foldable released in the United States. In fact, if we look at what they're charging for in China, and you translate it over, it's $562. Now, granted, if you do the same thing with the Plus or the Ultra version, you're looking at $801. So they're adding about $200 there. Well, if you do the same thing here, maybe we are looking at that, $750, $749. Like, that would be a pretty cool place for this thing to be. At any rate, guys, that is the news broken down as succinctly as I can possibly bring it to you. Subscribe for more content just like this. I will see you in the next one. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.